Hello, AP World History students. Right now we'll be looking at Chapter 37, Part 2, After Independence. Just a quick review on China. Recall that we had talked about the nationalists and the communists working together especially during World War II, but eventually Chiang Kai-shek would turn against the communists and exile them. The communists were exiled in this part of China, down here, and they gathered support. Now, Mao resisted the nationalists and embarked on, there's actually like a literal barricade here, and Mao and his followers broke out on the trail heading west and north. They actually marched 5,592 miles in 370 days and basically gained support along the way. In the end, I had a video I used to show that showed some just really simple farmers that followed along with Mao, really believing that Mao had the answer to a better China. The nationalists were exiled to Taiwan, and as I mentioned, which is a small island here, they took with him many of the treasures of the Forbidden City. So what did Mao look like under, or China look like under Mao, rather, in the 1950s and the 1960s? This sign here is a sign that says, destroy the old world, build a new world. But the reality is, especially in the years 1958 to 1962, that things did not go very well in China. First of all, the goal was to modernize with elimination of private property, and Mao was very, very intent on that. The first five-year plan began in 1955. Like Stalin's five-year plan to industrialize fails. In fact, part of the problem with his plan to industrialize is that it was based on really poor science. They did not want to take the Western science, and they created all kinds of fantastical ideas about how to industrialize that were just abject failures. The other thing that they did was collectivization, which was called the Great Leap Forward. And this lasted from 1958 to about 1961, 1962. Now, in this Great Leap Forward, basically what they did was they took apart all of the farms. They created communal kitchens for people to work in, and the quotas were so unrealistically high because basically Mao and his people just said, well, just plant the seeds really close together and everyone will be fine. We'll be able to increase our yields. And in reality, actually, this figure says 20 million, but books I've read recently said it was probably closer to 30 million people that starved to death. The reason, just a story that really struck me about this was, if a household had, let's say there was a grandmother, a grandfather, two parents, and three kids. Let's say one of the kids starved to death. Well, they would actually keep the child's body in the house, maybe buried underground in their own home, so they could still get their quota of food for their dead child. It was just a really, really horrible experience. The Cultural Revolution that occurred from 1966 to 1974. During the Cultural Revolution, Mao really elevated the status of the peasants and, in fact, discouraged the elite and the educated. These were targeted by the Red Guard, and what he wanted to do was return China to its agrarian past. If you were educated or elite, you were beaten or killed. If you were found to be, for example, a doctor and you had had a stethoscope, you might be killed just for having a stethoscope. Or you might be sent to what's called a re-education camp, where you would be taught the ways of the new China. And these were very brutal camps. They went on a book-burning campaign, and you might recall back to Qing Shi Huangdi that he did the same thing. They purged the party of any dissidents who disagreed with the Cultural Revolution, and in fact encouraged people to turn in teachers or parents who disagreed with the Cultural Revolution. Property was confiscated, and one of the saddest things is that it really did deprive China of talent and education. And as I talked to a father of a student of mine last year, he said that, really China is still recovering from this. There's a whole generation that was not educated because they were young people during the time of the Cultural Revolution. Now, in the 1980s, because most of their universities, there were a few that were still open, but many Chinese came to American universities in the 1980s, and that was probably the first time I met a Chinese person. Now, following Mao was Deng Xiaoping, and he was considered to be more of a moderate Maoist, even though he was a former victim of the Cultural Revolution. He had been sent to a cultural Chinese re-education camp, and but he did improve East-West relations. He suggested a socialist market economy, in other words, still having socialist services, but allowing people to have private goods and services that they could sell in a market economy. In 1989, the Tiananmen Square pro-democracy demonstrations were huge. I wish I had a picture of it on here, but there's a famous picture of a man standing in front of a tank. Now, what Deng Xiaoping's response was to send out the military, and in fact, there were students that were killed in that demonstration. As you can imagine, that was a little bit of a blow to East-West relations, because just earlier in the 1980s, China had opened up to Western visitors and to Western business. So that was a setback. However, China and America have recovered from that setback, obviously. China, I would say, still does have very much a socialist market economy. Although, having visited there, I will say that they are still very protective of their beloved Mao and their communist ideology. Indian democracy after independence. Well, first of all, it flourished under Indira Gandhi. She's not related to Mohandas Gandhi, but rather was a daughter of Nehru. You might remember from our earlier in the chapter. They promoted something called the Green Revolution, which was actually a agricultural revolution that did increase crop yields, unlike what occurred in China. However, they instituted repressive policies that would slow population and include forced sterilization. So after a woman would have a certain number of children, she would have to become sterilized. So Indira Gandhi was assassinated by Sikh bodyguards after an attack on Sikh extremists in Amritsar in 1984. So what that means, remember, Sikh is not Hindu, it's not Muslim, it's kind of a syncretic faith. And the Sikhs had been attacked, Sikh extremists had been attacked in Amritsar. That's where we saw the previous attack that I showed you the video of, and they ended up attacking and killing Indira Gandhi. Fragile democracy continued and continues to this day in India. The Iranian Revolution and Islamism. So far we've been talking about a lot of nationalism. Well, now we have people uniting under their faith of Islamism. So the Muslims were increasingly regarding Americans in negative terms and moved more towards more radicalism. Many Americans and Westerners were in Iran. Iran had very close relations with many Americans, and were living very lavishly, many of them were. So some of the more Islamic, extreme Islamists in Iran wanted to institute jihad or holy war. So the CIA supported the Iranian Shah Mohammad Reza Pahlavi from 1919 to 1980. He was overthrown by Islamists in the Iranian Revolution of 1979. And this was a pretty big deal. A lot of people had to flee Iran. And this picture here is a picture of American diplomats who were held hostage in the wake of the Iranian Revolution. There were a few attempts to rescue the hostages by the U.S., and eventually they were released after 2 years. All U.S. facilities were shut down, and any economic ventures of the U.S. were seized at that time. So this really caused a chill in Iranian-American relations that continues today. And you may or may not be aware that we're just trying to establish relations with Iran again, but they are very tense. The Iran-Iraq War lasted from 1980 to 1988. Now, this war had to do with oil, and it had to do with people. So here's Iraq, and this is a Shia area of Iraq. almost all of Iran is is Shia, which was formerly Persia. Iraq was formerly in the Ottoman Empire. So this conflict goes back to Persian and Ottoman conflicts. Now in Iraq we have both Sunni and Shia, and in Iran we have primarily Shia. This area is a Kurdish area, and this area even would prefer to be independent of both Iran and Iraq. So that was part of the conflict as well. And then if we look at this area, this is an ethnic Arab area, and there's a lot of oil around here, okay? So that's kind of the background. So Saddam Hussein, who was from Iraq and lived from 1937 to 2006, uses oil and U.S. support to build a huge military machine. Keep in mind, we would end up attacking and capturing Saddam Hussein later on. Both Iran and Iraq, as I mentioned, fight over oil and people. Iraq attacks Iran in 1980. The massive destruction that occurred, which included the use of chemical weapons in the Kurdish areas, ended in a stalemate between Iraq and Iran. When Saddam Hussein attacks Kuwait, this provokes the Gulf War in 1991, and later on, Iraq would be invaded by the U.S., but we'll talk about that later, and Saddam Hussein would be captured and executed. U.S.-led coalition drove Hussein out of Kuwait and led to further hardships for the Iraqi people. Iraq has been through a lot, not to say that I support anything that Saddam Hussein did, but the situation is very complicated, as our next chapter will discuss. Developments in Latin America. I'm just going to go through this really quickly, so pause the video and take some notes on this. Mexico, Argentina, dominated by military. And again, I'm not really even going to go through each of these points. You can read about them in your text. And in Guatemala. I want to end this video with just the economic dependence theory. This theory was suggested by Raúl Prebisch, an Argentine economist. I probably said that name wrong. But basically, his theory states that developed nations control world economy at the expense of undeveloped ones. I think there is a lot of evidence of that fact. And he suggested that developing nations need to protect their domestic industry and focus on internal development. Now, when we talk about Latin America in particular, it's important for Latin America to develop its internal resources. It's important for Africa. It's important for all of the developing nations to be able to develop an internal and independent infrastructure. And with that, I will end, and thank you so much for your attention.